Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. And it's an open forum today. 2 hours of open forum with Jimmy Akin. Perfect time to call 888-318-7884 because when Jimmy's here, the lines will fill up quickly. If you have a question about the Catholic faith, 888-318-7884. If you have a question about anything else, you're also welcome to call 888-318-7884. Anybody welcome. Jimmy Akin, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Hello, Jimmy.
Hello, Cy Kellett.
I hope you are doing well on this Thursday. Oh, yeah.
Doing great. How about you?
Pretty good. Are you in the path of all the... we've been seeing all these storms on the TV here. Are you in the path of all?
Not all of them. I mean, they're not like converging on northwest Arkansas, but...
Well, that's a relief.
Yeah. But we're expecting to get some precipitation tonight and tomorrow and some snow. And
nice.
hopefully I'm going to set out a pan tonight, and hopefully I'll get enough to make a bowl of snow ice cream.
And how do you do that? I don't know how to make snow ice cream. Is there a
Really?
recipe? No, I don't.
You grew up in Boston. You never had snow ice cream?
Not that I recall. No, I don't.
Okay, well, there are different ways of doing it. The way that we did it when I was a kid is you take snow and you add sugar and you add vanilla and you mix it all up, and then you've got snow ice cream. Oh. There are fancier ways of doing it, though. For example, instead of adding sugar, you could add sweetened condensed milk, which will give it a creamier texture.
Oh, yeah.
And so we got snow a few days ago. I went out to the store and got the supplies for snow ice cream. Unfortunately, we had only enough snow that I could make a few spoonfuls, and so I didn't open a can of sweetened condensed milk. And I didn't use sugar. I used a non-caloric sweetener. But I got a few spoonfuls, and I'm hoping I'll get enough snow before the winter's over to make a whole bowl.
Oh, I hope you do. Yeah. Jimmy. The number here is 888-318-7884. It's open forum, and that means, in addition to being open to anything, any question, that means open to anyone. You don't have to be Catholic to call. Anyone is welcome. 888-318-7884. Tomorrow, a new episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World will drop, and we are expecting what should we be expecting, Jimmy?
We're going to be talking about the Holy Fire. Are you familiar with that?
I don't.
Okay, so this is a miracle that's reported in Eastern Christian circles every year at Easter.
Okay.
Some officials from Eastern Christian churches go in to the tomb of Christ at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and they come out bearing fire that is on some candles they have, and all of the pilgrims who are there expecting them to come out with the fire have their own candles, and they spread this fire around, from candle to candle, and they even take it in special containers on airplanes to various world leaders in different countries, particularly Eastern Christian countries. And so this is widely understood as a miracle that occurs every year. It's popularly understood that way, but there's a question about, is this event actually a miracle or not? And so we're going to be given the background on the Holy Fire, and then we're going to look at the question of, is this a miracle, or is it something else? Is it a pious custom that is popularly regarded as a miracle?
Okay. The Holy Fire tomorrow morning on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Just go to mysterious.fm and you can find it. Jimmy, every line full already. Shall we go to the phones?
Sure, only way to open them up. Well, other than just hang up on everybody, but I don't want to do that.
Don't, Edgar. That was not a suggestion, Edgar. Colin's in Canada listening on Catholic.com. Colin, thanks for starting us off today. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi.
Hi, Colin.
I know we can truly merit reward from God through acts of charity, but if we commit a mortal sin and then are returned to a state of grace after that, is it only the acts of charity after returning to a state of grace which merit reward, or will the acts of charity previous to the mortal sin still merit reward?
The church does not have a teaching on this, but the standard theological opinion is what's known as the revival of merits. And so the idea is that when you commit a mortal sin, you're turning your back on the life of supernatural love that you had led up to that point, and therefore you're turning your back on all of the acts of love that is what merits a reward. You're turning your back on all those prior acts of love that you did, and so you won't receive a reward when you're in hell. On the other hand, when you repent and you turn back to God and reaffirm love of God, you are reaccepting and reaffirming all of the acts of love that you did under the action of God's grace. And so consequently, all of the good works, to use St. Paul's term for them, all of the good works that you did prior to your fall into mortal sin will be revived, and you will receive a reward for them.
Yeah, I've never heard of that before.
Mm-hmm. It's called the revival of merit. You can look it up.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for getting us started. 888-318-7884, the number. It is open forum. Jimmy Aiken is our guest, and now we go down to Texas. John's in Texas, watching on YouTube. Hi, John. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Mr. Aiken, can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir, John. And just so folks know, you don't need to ask if I can hear you okay. If we can't hear you, we'll tell you.
Yes, sir. All right. My two-part question today is, what is your timeline of events that happened prior to the fall? Where did diseases, death, and other natural evils come from? Last week I asked you about Romans 8:21, and this is my fault. I should have read the verses to you. I'll read them briefly. Romans 8:20-21 says, "For the creation was subjected to frustration." Some translations say futility. Not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. I don't believe Paul is referring to human creation here, because in verse 23, 2 verses later, Paul writes, "And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, grown inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons." Do you hold to something like the angelic fall theodicy to explain natural evils?
Okay, so we're starting from a different interpretation of this, and so that's going to affect my answer to your question. Just so I'm clear on the two parts of your question, you asked first, when do I think that things like disease and death came from, and secondly, where do you think I think they came from? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so my interpretation is in Romans 8, when Paul refers to creation, he's referring to human creation. It's like if I said, oh, the whole of creation knows that Joe Biden is the current president of America. I'm not claiming that every microbe knows that or every rock knows that. I'm talking about the human creation. He's the most famous, political leader in the world. Or if I said, or some other political leader, I could say the whole of creation or the whole world, same thing. The whole of creation knows that Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia. It would be the same thing. I mean the whole human creation, and I think that's what St. Paul is talking about here. The whole of human creation, because it's fallen, has been subjected to futility or frustration in the wake of the fall of man, and that was something that was in accord with God's will. So we're living with a fallen human creation, and to illustrate the depth of that, St. Paul then says, and even we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we're subject to that. So that's where I'm coming from on this. And consequently, I would say that disease and death are coterminous, and I'll explain that, but it means they've been around as long as we've had life forms. And I would point to the Catechism of the Catholic Church for support for that. It notes that as part of God's plan for the world, there is a continuous. The world is created in a state of journeying towards its final destiny, and as long as that journey is incomplete, it contains both creative and destructive elements, the creation of some life forms and the disappearance of others. And so there isn't a specific point other than the first appearance of life where death also came into the world. The first life form, whatever it was, something microbial, no doubt, is no longer alive. And so death came into the world not too long after the appearance of life. And that's, even though Aquinas wouldn't have had the time scale that modern scientists proposed. He essentially agreed with that. He said, and I think this is right, human death entered the world through the fall. But the nature of creatures like carnivores, like lions and tigers, that didn't change. So even before the fall of man, you would have had, lions eating gazelles and tigers eating whatever tigers eat over in Asia. And there would have been animal death and plant death before the fall. We even see, as I think I mentioned last week, plant death before the fall, because God gives Adam and Eve permission to eat from any tree in the garden except the tree of life. And when you eat plants, the plant matter that you're eating dies. So we already see plant death in the world prior to the fall. And we're never told that animal death is something new with the fall. What God says to Adam and Eve is he gives them access to the tree of life, so as long as they eat from that, they'll stay alive. But he says if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll die. And when they do eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they're kicked out of Eden, so they no longer have access to the tree of life, and therefore they'll die. But other animals aren't living in Eden either. They don't have, not all the animal population of the world lived in the Garden of Eden, so they didn't have access to the tree of life to keep them alive, and they were naturally subject to death. As Aquinas says, every natural system is subject to corruption or decay, and it will therefore run down or break down over time unless it's specially propped up by grace. In the case of mankind, we had access to that grace prior to the fall, but we don't have an indication from Genesis that other creatures did as well. We've got really good evidence from the fossil record that there was death in the world prior to the arrival of mankind, and the Catechism acknowledges that. It refers to the process of evolution, where you have the development of new life forms and the extinction of other life forms as part of God's plan.
John, I'm going to leave it there because we've got to go to that first break, but thank you for the question. I hope that was helpful. Right back with more Open Forum with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
We're here for you. Call now. Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
On Mother Angelica Answering the Call, Father Joseph and Doug Keck mine decades of phone calls answered by Mother Angelica. Mother dishes out teaching, advice, laughter, and plenty of prayers as she takes calls from her family.
Mother Angelica Answering the Call, Sunday afternoon, 2 Eastern, on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Hey, now that we've started the new year, we invite you to join the hundreds of people who are already taking the St. Peter's 20 Answers Challenge. Here's how it works. You visit shop.catholic.com today and pick up your St. Peter's 20 Answers sampler, a great collection of 30 books that you can pick up for a great price right now. Then you begin your own version of St. Peter's 20 Answers Challenge. That's reading all 30 books in the collection during 2024. Easily doable if you put your mind to it. And think how much you'll learn from all that, how many answers you'll get. 600 answers, as a matter of fact, across those 30 books. You can pick up your copy of St. Peter's 20 Answers sampler right now at shop.catholic.com, shop.catholic.com. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It's an open forum, and every line full except for one. Line 2 is open if you want it, 888-318-7884. We'll go to Caesar now in Odessa, Texas, watching on Facebook. Caesar, we're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Hi, before Christmas, I had a few coworkers invite me to their non-denominational church services, but I denied them primarily because we were leaving the country for the holidays. But I also didn't just want to say, no, thank you, I'm Catholic. So So I can answer them. How can I answer them without boasting about the church being the fulfillment of Jesus, but opening a door for conversation if they want to have that?
Okay. Well, I might decouple the two things. If they invite you, now in this case, you could easily say, "Oh, I appreciate it, but no thanks. I'm going to be out of the country for the holidays." On the other hand, if they say, "Hey, if they renew the invitation and they say, "Hey, do you want to come to our non-denominational church?" You can say, "Oh, I appreciate the invitation. I thank you very much." You can actually go to their Protestant church. It's not a fulfillment of your Sunday obligation, so you're going to need to make sure you go to a Catholic church to fulfill your Sunday obligation. But for the sake of friendship or opening a dialogue or things like that, you could go to their church and you could say, "Hey, I'm open to doing that if you're open to visiting my Catholic church." And you could have a reciprocal exchange where you go to their church and they come to your church, and then you can get together afterwards and have a conversation about what they saw and what you saw and the differences between the churches. And that way you're not as you indicated, Caesar, you're not starting from a position of triumphalism, of trying to look down on them. You're effectively putting yourself on the same level. Now, you and I know that, okay, the Catholic Church is the true church, but you're not boasting of that fact up front. Instead, you're saying, "Hey, we could have an exchange here. We could both use this as an opportunity to learn more about each other." And that would be perfectly fine. If you don't want to go to their church, you could say, "Well, I appreciate the invitation. I think it's great you're going to church. That's wonderful. I happen to be Catholic, and so that's where I go to church. And if you ever want to have a conversation about that, I'm happy to discuss it with you."
Caesar?
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Caesar, if you want to hang on, I'd like to send you a copy of Jimmy's book, The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness, and Where to Find It. I think you'll enjoy the book, and also it's got a lot in there that you might share with others. So hang on if you'd like a copy of it. It's open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest, and you are welcome to call 888-318-7884. Kevin's in New York listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Kevin, thanks for downloading the app onto your phone. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, thanks for having me. So, Jimmy, my question is, so a lot of Protestants who are well-versed in history will use the point that for the first, 1,000 years or so, 900 years, the Church Fathers didn't actually unanimously say there are exactly 7 sacraments. They do mention them, right? But some of them give more numbers, some of them give less numbers. So they're not denying that penance or marriage is a sacrament, but there's never 7 until at least the 1000s, 1200s. What's a reasonable explanation for that? Why wouldn't the Church early on say these are distinct ordinances or rites from holy water or holy salt? Why were they kind of bunched in together with some Church Fathers?
Okay, well, I wouldn't say it's never 7 until the Middle Ages, but there is certainly a diversity of number of sacraments that are proposed by different Christian authors. And the fundamental reason for that is the term sacrament has changed meaning over time. So it applied to different numbers of things. Originally, the term sacramentum, which is a Latin term, meant something like oath or secret. And there were it came to be applied in a Christian context to certain rites that were sacred that Christians would do. And initially, that was basically all something needed to be considered a sacrament. So if you blessed salt or you blessed holy water, then it would become sacred. That's what the blessing does. It's what makes it holy. And so you could have any number of different sacred things, as a result of blessings. Coronation of kings was one of those sometimes. You could have blessings of friendships. You could have all kinds of different blessings. And consequently, you had all kinds of different sacred rites that you could call sacraments. Eventually, though, by the time of the Middle Ages, the term sacrament began to be used in a way that required some additional conditions. In addition to it being a rite that was sacred in some way, it needed to be established by Jesus, and it needed to convey God's grace in a kind of special way, where we have a promise from God that if you do the right, he'll give you his grace, and assuming you're not putting a barrier in the way, like mortal sin or something like that. And so that then led to a period where authors began to reflect on, well, how many, under this new definition, how many such rites are there? How many sacred rites are there that were established by Jesus and that will convey grace? And when they reflected on that, you started to have a consolidation around a smaller number of sacraments. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Peter Lombard who wrote a very influential work of theology in the Middle Ages known as the Sentences, that proposed that there are essentially 7 such rites that meet these conditions. And following Peter Lombard, the number 7 became widely accepted as people had a chance to reflect on it. It's like, yeah, it seems these 7 meet those conditions. And all the sacred rites that didn't meet those conditions, we then came up with a new term for. And today they're called sacramentals. And so we have a difference between sacraments, which are the ones that Jesus established to communicate grace, and other sacred rites that are now called sacramentals. So the reason you had this flexibility in terms of number of sacraments, whether it was, way more than 7 or around 7 or even less than 7, was because the term sacrament was flexible in its meaning and didn't acquire its modern meaning until the Middle Ages.
That's a great explanation. Thank you.
Okay,
yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that question. It's open forum. All the lines are full, so on we go. We're going to Phil in Canada, watching on YouTube. Phil, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Thank you so much for having me on, gentlemen. I'm a longtime listener.
Oh, well, we're glad to have you, Kevin. Oh, I'm sorry. This is Phil. I apologize, Phil. Welcome, Phil. I made a mistake there.
No problem at all. One thing I'm having trouble reconciling in my mind is I'm curious why, as Catholics, we are permitted to embalm our deceased relative. I see it as, we're quite strict as Catholics, which I like, that we believe in the resurrection of our bodies, and so, putting things into the sewer system doesn't seem like that's, in the same vein as that, or it not being environmentally friendly is not taking care of our earth, or even exposing funeral home workers to unhealthy chemicals. I'm not seeing how that's permitted.
Okay, well, in any system of law, liberty is presumed. So unless there's a rule against something, you're allowed to do it. So what would be reasons why we should not embalm our loved ones? What makes that unacceptable in your eyes?
Just kind of curious. First and foremost, just with our belief in the resurrection of our bodies at the end, trying to keep the body intact is kind of one thought. And so kind of pushing bodily fluids, into the sewer system doesn't seem in line with kind of keeping that body intact, as well as being environmentally friendly. An idea that I was kind of thinking that perhaps that's not taking care of the earth that, God's entrusted us with. And then, of course, our fellow brothers and sisters who are, doing the embalming, who are working for the funeral home, for example. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exposing them to either carcinogenics or, at a minimum, something not so healthy.
Okay, so let's take those one by one. The first one you mentioned was the first two that you actually mentioned were both essentially variations on a common theme. Now, it's true that God's going to raise the body on the last day. We're all going to be resurrected. And that may, although this is not actually church teaching, that may involve the same matter. that was in the body when it was alive. It obviously won't involve all of the same matter that was in the body when it was alive, because matter passes in and out of us over the course of our lifetimes. A given atom that's in my body presently may not be there a month from now and may not be there at the time of my death. So matter passes through us all the time. And it's really up to God what matter he's going to use to resurrect us with. But just supposing that God wants to use the same matter we had in us at the time of our death, there's something very interesting to say that I'll say on the other side of the break.
Jimmy's like a professional at this, leaving you with the tease. All right, we'll come back with an answer to that question and more with Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live. Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or at a good Catholic bookstore. Visit whywe'recatholic.com.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
What if the voice of your deepest doubts about Catholicism rose up in the form of a human being and challenged you to defend your most foundational beliefs? That's the task apologist Trent Horn took upon himself in his new book, Devil's Advocate, a dialogue with his own best objections against the faith that he professes and defends. You can stand up against your doubts, and Trent will show you how. Pick up your copy of Devil's Advocate today at shop.catholic.com or at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. A little bit of groovy music for you there. A professional radio tease before we went to the break. Jimmy Akin, our guest, it's an open forum, and he was in the midst of answering a question from Phil in Canada about why we embalm, or why I shouldn't say we embalm, why we permit embalming in the Catholic Church. And Jimmy, take it away.
Yeah, so let's suppose God decides that he wants to use exactly the same matter for your resurrected body that was in your body at the time of your death. Well, that matter could all be concentrated in one place. Like if we just took your body and stuck it in a grave with no embalming, but it also could be scattered. Like in the case of people who get cremated and then they have their relatives scatter their ashes. That's not the Catholic custom, but it is something that some people do. Mm-hmm. And if you want to project into the future, well, you could even, put someone's body in a transporter and dematerialize it and rematerialize it in scattered atom form throughout the cosmos. And well, so let's consider those three options. Which of those, Psychelet, is the hardest for God to go get that matter with that was in your body at the very moment of death in order to create your resurrected body? Which of those would you say is the hardest for God?
The last one.
Why?
Well, I'm not sure. I think I might have missed one or two.
Okay. Well, let me make it easy for you.
Yeah.
Nothing is hard for God.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Because God has infinite resources.
Yeah,
He's omnipotent. When we think of something as hard, it's because we have limited resources that we have to expend on accomplishing something. But we are finite. God is infinite, and therefore God has infinite resources to do anything with. And therefore everything is equally easy for God. So it's not like we need to keep the matter in one place, or it's going to be harder for God to resurrect someone. And actually, in the typical course of nature, the matter does scatter. And God tells Adam, "Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return." And what does dust do? Well, it scatters. Even if you put it underground in a grave, water's going to seep through. It's going to carry particles that used to be in someone's body away as that water moves through the ground. So we already have natural scattering of the atoms that were in our body. And it's not a strain for God to pull those back together if that's what he chooses to do, because everything is equally easy for God because he's got unlimited resources. And consequently, we don't need to be concerned about, do we need to keep the body together? Not for God's sake. And we actually do substantially keep the body together. If we embalm our loved ones, most of their body stays together, but parts of it, like bodily fluids, may be taken out of the body, or things like that. But that's not creating we already have that happening as part of the natural processes anyway, and it's not going to make it any harder for God. The second article that Phil mentioned is he was concerned about and this is related to the first, he was concerned about, is this friendly to nature? Well, we can't create or annihilate matter. We're not God. All we can do is move matter around. And so it doesn't matter whether you embalm someone or disintegrate them or cremate them or whatever. Those atoms have to go somewhere. We can't, they're going to remain in the material world. And therefore, it's just a question of where are you going to put them? It doesn't harm nature to have those atoms around, whether they were parts of bodily fluids or something else. And the death of an individual human being, while it's going to have a local effect, is not really going to have a global effect. So we're not doing any kind of systemic damage to the planet by discharging some bodily fluids or something like that, provided we're doing it in a sanitary way. I mean, even if you just stuck the body in a grave, the microbes are going to eat it anyway. You're going to have human decay, actually on an even greater scale. If you don't embalm, if you just put someone in a grave, you're going to have human decay happening in the earth anyway. And it's going to be on an even greater scale, because one of the things that they do when they embalm you is they arrange it so that the decay process is dramatically slowed down. They, for example, may replace bodily fluids with formaldehyde, which is a chemical that kills microbes and therefore will preserve the body for longer. And consequently, by the introduction of formaldehyde, you're actually going to retard the process of decay, and so if it's unsanitariness of having parts of human remains like bodily fluids in the earth, well, you're actually being more friendly by retarding the human decay that would otherwise occur. But that brings up formaldehyde, which leads to Phil's third question about is it good for funeral home workers, for morticians, to be exposed to chemicals like this? Well, formaldehyde is a toxic chemical, but that just because something's toxic doesn't mean that humans are forbidden to use it. Lots of things are toxic. Alcohol is toxic, but that doesn't mean humans should never be exposed to alcohol. In fact, in various settings like hospitals, they need to use alcohol and other disinfectants. And that's basically what formaldehyde is. It's a disinfectant. So it's not that you can't use something just because it's a disinfectant, which means it's toxic to microbes and possibly humans. It just means you need to manage that. And you need to not take unacceptable risks. You need to use things like formaldehyde and other toxic substances with prudence and caution so that you're not putting people at undue risk. And as long as you're not putting funeral home workers at undue risk, then there's not a fundamental moral problem here. So those are some of the considerations that I would use to respond to the concerns Phil raised. I also would point out that that we have precedent for embalming in Scripture itself. As I mentioned with you, Psychelet, there are at least 2 people in the Bible who are very closely connected to the history of ancient Israel that were in fact embalmed. Because in Egypt, they embalmed people. Now, they did it a little differently than we do it. For example, they didn't use formaldehyde. Instead, they used a substance called natron, which is kind of a combination of salt and baking soda. It occurs naturally in the desert in Egypt, but they would get natron, and for a period of like 30 days, they would remove the organs of the body, they would pack the body with natron, and that would absorb the moisture of the body so that there would not be moisture for the microbes to use in decomposing the body, and that would retard the process of decomposition. And this was part of the mummification process, the full sweep of which, including all the burial rites and stuff, took about 70 days. And there are 2 closely connected figures with Israel's history that were mummified in Egypt. Do you know their names, Psychelet?
I think it would be Joseph.
That's one of them. Yep.
And then was his father mummified, or
Jacob? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Israel himself, because Jacob is Israel. Israel himself was mummified. And that kind of sets a precedence, saying, hey, this doesn't look like there's anything wrong here. As long as you're embalming people in a way that doesn't cause problems, then there's, particularly for humans, because you can't really cause problems for God, then there's nothing fundamentally wrong here. Does that help you out, Phil?
Hang on, Phil. Let me get you on the air. Does that help you?
Oh, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time you took to answer. Just one point of clarity, if you don't mind. Sorry.
Sure.
Just the environmental question was just about not necessarily about the body decomposing, but just about the chemicals. But you kind of touched on that, I guess, suppose, with the formaldehyde piece as well. But just the chemicals in the ground was kind of that concern. But I appreciate all the clarity, and I just want to say I always love when you wear a superhero T-shirt. I'm a big DC Comics fan, so I've seen some Flash and Green Lantern T-shirts over the time.
Yep, I'm a DC Comics fan too. I've got a lot of DC Comics T-shirts. By the way, I would mention regarding after you put the formaldehyde in the body and you put the body in the ground, typically what people do is they put them in a coffin. And often these are metal coffins that will block water flow. They're sometimes put in cement with cement coverings as well. And so that formaldehyde in any normal timescale is not going to be leaking out into the ground anyway.
Phil, thank you very, very much. Jimmy, before I go to the break, it's conceivable then, unless I'm mistaken, that the body of Jacob and the body of Joseph could be found.
Oh, sure. Well, hypothetically, they could still exist. We have, in fact, mummified remains of pharaohs that lived long before Jacob and Joseph. But when the Israelites left Egypt at the Exodus, they took those bodies with them and they put them in a cave, the cave at Machpelah, which was Abraham's family's ancestral burying ground in Egypt. And if they were still there, we'd probably know about them.
Oh, yeah. We would probably know about them already, yeah. All right. We'll take a break. Phil, thanks again for the call. It's open forum. Jimmy Akin is our guest. You are welcome to call 888-318-7884.
Hello, this is Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone of San Francisco. Keep your dial tuned to Catholic Answers Live.
In Morse code, the sequence SOS is a distress call. It's been said that it stands for Save Our Souls. Well, right now our world is in big trouble, and we're putting out an SOS call for help. Will you answer that call? St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, has hundreds of teams who share the good news with souls who don't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to get involved.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
Human beings are God's greatest masterpiece. Every person is made in the image and likeness of God. But every saint, that is, every person who accepts God's invitation, his upward call to make them holy. And so every story presents us with a unique masterpiece that God is writing.
The Journey Home, Monday night, 8 Eastern, on EWTN Radio and television.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest. It is open forum, and the lines have just stayed full today, as they often do when Jimmy is here. But you're welcome to call. As lines open up, we'll get you on 888-318-7884. Next, we're going to Louisiana. Mark's in Louisiana. Mark, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy. Mark? Oh, I think Mark might be on what's that thing? Mute. I'm going to come back to you, Mark. Right now, I'll go to Matt in Michigan watching on YouTube. Mark, don't go anywhere, though. I'm going to come back and try you again. Matt in Michigan, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Cy. Hey, Jimmy. Thanks for taking my call. I am a lifelong Protestant who's now making my way into the church. And
oh, great.
I have some questions. Obviously, Mary is a big issue for people like me. And I have been listening to a lot of your content and Trent Horn and others. But I am wondering how we read Revelation in its tense, and how do we pick out what is present, future, past, and especially focusing in on the Revelation chapter 12 about the woman and giving birth. The second part of my question would be, why does it describe her as having labor pains if we also can say Mary did not have labor pains as a result of the curse because she's sinless?
Okay. So in regard to both of these questions, the church does not have a teaching. The church does not have any teaching about how to interpret, which parts of Revelation pertain to the past or the present or the future. And similarly, the church doesn't have a teaching regarding Mary and labor pains. So all we can do here is use informed biblical interpretation and speculation on these issues. So what I can do with regard to the first question is tell you how I read the book of Revelation. And I've done an extensive study of this. Now, pretty much everybody agrees that the early chapters of Revelation, at least through chapter 3, pertain to the first century, to the beginning of Christian history. And pretty much everybody agrees that the final chapters of Revelation, like from the end of chapter 20 forward, pertain to the end of Christian history. The question is about that chunk in the middle, from the beginning of chapter 4 to the end, to the kind of the middle of chapter 20. Where does that apply to? And there are different theories. One theory is that most of that material, or all of that material, is bunched up towards the beginning of Christian history. Another says that it's spread out through Christian history, so that you have, maybe chapter 4 applies to the 2nd century and chapter 5 applies to the 3rd century, and you have kind of a roadmap of Christian history. There's also another view that says this material applies to the bulk of Christian history, but not in a kind of roadmap or timeline way. Instead, it reflects material that's going to come up periodically throughout church history. And then you have the futurist position that says the bulk of this material applies to events that are still in our future, towards the end of Christian history. So those are sort of the four basic positions. And by the way, Psychelet, I've got a book like 20 Answers Revelation.
Okay.
I want to make sure that we send Matt a copy of it.
All right.
Now, I think that the evidence best supports the view that most of this material applies to the beginning of Christian history. That's not to say it also doesn't contain themes that recur in Christian history, and it's not to say that there won't in the future be a recapitulation of some of these same themes. But if you look at the book of Revelation itself in its literal sense, meaning what was the author trying to communicate to his audience, what would the original audience have understood him to mean, I think it's clear he's talking about stuff that's going to happen towards the beginning of Christian history, because he says this is going to happen soon. And he says that at the beginning of the book, that this vision reveals what's going to happen soon, and he says it at the end of the book, that this vision reveals what's going to happen soon. And although soon can be taken in counterintuitive senses, the natural sense is soon from John's perspective. And so that gives us a significant piece of evidence that would suggest that this material is going to be happening towards the beginning of Christian history. There are other pieces of evidence within the book that also suggest that. A careful study, for example, of the beast with 7 heads suggests that the 7 heads represent the line of Roman emperors in the 1st century. And so that would be more evidence that that the center part of the book, where the beast is featured, that also applies to the beginning of Christian history. There's also a challenge that needs to be met. If you want to say that most of the book primarily applies to the future, then you got a problem, because you need to find a place in the book that represents a long period of time. Because you've got, if most of the book applies to the future, then there needs to be something in the book that conveys the idea of a long period of time passing where we can fit in. If most of it's in our future, well, we need to be somewhere in this book. So where are we? Well, if you read through the book, looking for a long period of time, there is one. It's at the beginning of chapter 20, where we have this millennium, or period of a figurative 1,000 years. That's a number that just means a lot, and so here we have this long period of time. But notice it's at the end. It's in chapter 20, right before the material everybody agrees is in our future. And what that suggests is the material that precedes Revelation 20 is in our past, and we're living in that millennium right now. It's a period where the devil is bound in such a way that he can't stop the proclamation of the gospel, and thus can't deceive the nations, because the gospel is going forward. So I think that's the most natural relation of the book of Revelation to history. And you can read more about that in my book, 20 Answers Revelation. When it comes to the second part of your question, Matt, about the woman in Revelation 12, the first thing I would say is that this woman, although she does represent Mary because she's depicted as giving birth to Jesus, so of course she's his mom, duh, she's not limited to the Virgin Mary. She also represents the nation, the people of Israel, and we see that because she's got she's clothed in the sun, she's got the moon at her feet, and she's got a crown of 12 stars. That imagery is drawn from Joseph's dream in the book of Genesis, where it represents the family of Israel. And so just like the Virgin Mary is the individual woman that gives birth to the Messiah, the nation of Israel is the nation that gives birth to the Messiah. And you can also look at her as representing, in some sense, the church, the spiritual Israel. And you could even propose that she's, in some sense, she's being represented as the new Eve, because notice we have a conflict here between the woman, her seed, and the ancient serpent. just like in Genesis 3:15. John is using the image of the dragon, which he tells us is the ancient serpent or the devil. And we've got a conflict with the woman's seed, Jesus, and the serpent. So we also have here a recapitulation of Genesis 3:15. So what does that mean in terms of the birth pangs that she experiences? Well, okay, first thing is, since she represents more than one thing, it would be possible for the birth pains to apply, say, to the nation of Israel, but not literally to the Virgin Mary herself. So one possibility would be to understand the birth pains as applying, to something other than the individual Mary. They may be representing a more collective experience of Israel went through a lot of convulsions when the Messiah was brought forth into the world, and that was certainly true. On the other hand, it never actually says, if you read Genesis, God doesn't say, I'm going to create birth pains that you otherwise would never experience. What God says to Eve is, because you've eaten this fruit, I'm going to multiply your birth pains. And so that would suggest that that Eve and women in general would have had birth pains even in an unfallen state. They just wouldn't have been as bad as they are now. And so it's not actually church teaching that Mary didn't have birth pains. She might have had birth pains, and they were just less severe than those that a fallen woman would have had. So that's another possible explanation along those lines. There's more that I could say, but we're getting close to the end of the hour, so I hope that's sufficient, Matt.
And Matt, hang on. We'll send you a copy of Jimmy's book, 20 Answers Revelation. If you just give us an address, we'll get it off to you. Let's try Mark in Louisiana again. Mark, welcome. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy, how are y'all?
Doing okay. What can I do for you? We're getting close to the end of the hour.
Okay. I hope I don't complicate it by asking it the wrong way, but I want to pose a situation where people spontaneously start to pray for someone.
Okay.
But you may not agree theologically with them because you're of different faiths. And so to what degree should I accept a prayer for someone? Just suppose someone who's satanic and they want to start praying for you. And then there's the other extreme where it's John Paul II who wants to pray for you. So you get in the crux of my question. Where is it acceptable
okay,
to
so,
say, no, I don't
so if you have someone who's praying to the creator of the universe, even if they're not a Christian, if they're praying to the creator of the universe, then the creator of the universe, God, knows that they're talking to him. And so if someone wants to pray to the creator of the universe for me, I'm fine with that, even if they don't understand the creator of the universe fully properly. On the other hand, they could be praying to someone else. Like, let's suppose it's Zeus. Okay, Zeus was a deity in the Greek pantheon. He was not the creator of the universe, but he was a spiritual being. And I'd say, well, I don't really think there is a Zeus. Thank you for the prayer, but I'm not spiritually opening myself to help from Zeus. So if someone's specifically praying to a non-Christian deity, for me, I'm gonna kind of close myself to that. If there's someone out there impersonating Zeus, it's probably a demon. I don't want to really be helped by that person. On the other hand, if someone is openly praying to a demon on my behalf, it's like, whoa, thank you, but no. I would like St. Michael to protect me and keep any demonic activity far away from me. So I would definitely be closed to someone openly praying to the forces of darkness for me. That's a separate question than would I tell them shut up, there could be different circumstances on that. They got a knife at my throat. I might not tell them to shut up right now. I might just ask St. Michael for his protection.
Mark, thank you very much for the question. I'm glad we got to talk with you. Lots more folks on the line. Should be 2 lines open during the break if you'd like to call. We'd like to get you in the line, 888-318-7884. Jimmy Akin is our guest. He'll be back for another hour. It's open forum. You're welcome to ask whatever you like. You don't have to be Catholic to call. 888-318-7884. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kelly, your host. Happy to be here with Jimmy Akin, the man behind Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, a very popular podcast, consistently in the top 20 documentary podcasts when it comes out. Sometimes fighting its way into the top 10 documentary podcasts.
And we tend to peak in the top 10. Yeah, we tend to peak around number 8, although a recent episode I did peaked at number 5.
Well, I'm curious about that. What was the popular episode? Like, what did people like?
Disturbing near-death experiences.
Oh, I can get that. Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, and I've been surprised. I mean, it was the first one of the year, and so we had some people coming back from the holidays, who were not listening when they're on vacation and stuff. So I expected a bump there, but I didn't expect that much of a bump. And quite a number of people have said they thought it was one of the best episodes ever, that it was definitely going to be one of their favorite episodes of the year, things like that. Some even said it was their favorite episode of all time.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah.
That's very nice. What number are you up to now? I know I ask you this every now and then, but
we're in the 390s. In terms of numbered episodes, we also have bonus episodes that aren't part of the regular numbering. This tomorrow is going to be 293. And on Saturday, we're going to be recording we're going to record 4 episodes on Saturday, finishing with 301.
Wow, that's great. So I think you have probably surpassed the Carol Burnett show in the number of episodes.
Possibly. I'd have to check. She was on the air for a long time, though, and back then TV seasons were longer. But,
that's right,
however that may be, I'm so glad we had this time together.
Now you make your grandmother happy, seeing you pulling your ear like that. I think that's why Carol Burnett did that, pulled her ear. She was like, that was to let her grandma know she was all right or something.
Oh, okay. I know Penn Jillette has his third fingernail painted as a sign to his mom.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. I got to think of something to do and someone to do it for. I should be. Sit. That's for my dogs, if the case they're listening. Sit. Now they're going to be disappointed. They're not going to get a treat now.
I was going to say, you're supposed to give them a treat, at least in the training
bad
phase.
Training.
You know what I did? What I did when my sister was on vacation for Christmas, I took care of her dog.
Yeah.
And her dog is an Australian Shepherd, a miniature Australian Shepherd, and they're supposed to be wicked smart among dogs and really good at training, very eager to please. And my sister had already been training the dog. Luna is the dog's name. Had been training Luna with, sit and down and all kinds of things like that. And she explained before she left that she was working on stay. And she was about 70% on stay. And so I decided I'm going to continue Luna's training for stay. And I started, I'd give her, like my sister said, I'd give her the sit command first, and she'd sit down. And then I'd give her the stay command, and I'd put my hand between her eyes and mine to block the gaze. Apparently that helps. And, so I'd put my hand between my eyes and hers and say, stay. And then I'd walk a few feet away, and then I'd give her the come command, and she'd immediately rush over to me, and I'd give her her treat. And so during the week I had her, I progressively increased the distance between me and her. I also stopped telling her to sit first, and I stopped putting my hand between us. I would just say, stay. And she would stay, and then I would back away, and I got progressively further and further away until I was going into different rooms before I gave the come command. I even started hiding in the closets. And
you and the dog having a fun time together.
Yeah, and so we were playing hide and seek stay.
Oh, that's
fun.
Now,
when she can't see me when I give the command, she's having to navigate by ear, so I'd have to repeat the come command to let her figure out where I am. But we're doing hide and seek stay, and she was up to 100% performance.
Oh, that's cool.
It wasn't 70% anymore, and she would look for me and find me in weird places that you wouldn't expect, where I wasn't in obvious sight.
Oh, that's a fun. And now, did it stick when your sister tried it? Do you know?
I haven't asked my sister that, but I'm pretty sure it did, because Luna's a really smart dog.
Oh, Well, good work, Luna. Good work on that. I love watching the sheep guys. They just whistle different whistles at the dogs. It's amazing. All right, let's go to Frank in Illinois, listening on the EWTN app. Frank, we're glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Okay, my question is this, sure. I know I've read in Scripture that I've heard that faith without works is dead. And I've also read in Scripture that the Lord said, what you did for the least of these, you did for me. And my question is, would I be fulfilling that obligation by contributing to different Catholic organizations and Christian, organizations that need money?
Frank, I'm sorry. I don't know if you have us on speakerphone or what, but your audio is really muddy. I'm not sure that I got the question.
Okay. I know it says in Scripture that faith without works is dead. And I know it says in Scripture that our Lord said, what you've done for the least of these, you've done for me.
Right.
So I was wondering if by giving money to different Christian organizations or different Catholic orders, if that would fulfill that obligation.
Okay, well, we're called by God to both love God and love our neighbor, and by donating to a religious order, you are essentially kind of doing both of those at once. The fact that they're a charitable order that receives donations, okay, that's loving our neighbor so that they have what they need to take care of their members and pursue their work. And also, since it's a religious order, it has a special extra kind of orientation towards God. And so, giving to a religious order would contribute towards, fulfilling the good works that we're called to do in Christ's name.
Oh, that sure is good to hear. Thank you so much for that answer.
Yeah, now I should say that's having done that, that's not necessarily all you need to do. There are other pressing needs in the world as well. You'll notice in the parable of the sheep and the goats from Matthew 25 that you just quoted, Jesus named several different things that people could do that would contribute towards fulfilling their obligations. He mentioned visiting the sick. He mentioned visiting prisoners. So there are other things besides just giving to religious orders. If you see a pressing need, you want to do what you can to try to assist with that pressing need if it's reasonable for you to do so.
Okay. God bless you guys and happy New Year. Thank you for your answer.
Oh, thank you.
You too.
Yeah, thank you. God bless you and Happy New Year. The number's 888-318-7884. We'll take a quick break and we'll be right back with more calls for Jimmy Akin on Catholic Answers Live.
Let us help you with your question today on Catholic Answers Live.
Do you have a question but prefer to ask it privately? Catholic Questions can help. Go to CatholicQuestions.com to ask your question online, email us, drop us a letter, or give us a call. Longtime Catholic Answers Live apologist and author Jim Blackburn or another Catholic Questions apologist will be happy to assist you. Catholic Questions proudly supports Catholic Answers Live, so visit us at CatholicQuestions.com today. That's CatholicQuestions.com.
Catechism in a Year with me, Father Mike Schmitz, is coming soon to Catholic Radio. Encounter God's plan of sheer goodness for us, revealed in Scripture and passed down through the tradition of the Catholic faith as we journey together toward our heavenly home.
Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, starting Monday at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Jimmy Akin is our guest. And it's an open forum. You can call and ask whatever you'd like. 888-318-7884. Do you make any predictions for the new year, Jimmy, or you don't get into that business?
Predictions?
Yeah.
No, not typically.
No.
My precognition isn't that sharp and tends to be spontaneous.
Do you for no reason, I'm just curious, do you think that this is the year that the robots take over, or
not this year?
Not this year. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Rick in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, listening to EWTN on Channel 130 Sirius XM satellite radio. Rick, thanks for being here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call.
Hi, Rick.
A question about Genesis. The original account to not partake of the tree of good, knowledge of good and evil, and but then there's this passage in Genesis 3:22 where God talks about that to prevent, because of their sin, that He's going to have to prevent them from eating of the tree of life. And I'm wondering, do we have any church fathers that have commented on that as to what that implied? Had they eaten of the tree of life before they ate of the tree of good and evil, or after they sinned? What were the implications of what was this tree of life?
Okay, well, so the Catechism of the Catholic Church notes that these early chapters of Genesis contain a lot of figurative language. They communicate spiritual truths that are genuinely true, but they use symbolism to convey them. And so, for example, John Paul II interpreted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil not as a literal tree, like some species of tree that would be identifiable today, but as a symbol representing the bounds on human freedom. And Adam and Eve then transgressed those bounds. And presumably, he would interpret the tree of life similarly, not as a literal tree with some identifiable species, but as a symbol of the union of God and man that would allow man to continue living. Having said that, if we just seek to interpret, the text, what is it? How does the text present matters, regardless of what you would have seen if you had a time machine and could watch it in first person? I'd have to check. I mean, the Church Fathers had a lot to say about Genesis 3 and so forth. I know they talked a lot about these trees, but I'd have to do some research in order to say, well, did they have a prevailing theory about whether Adam had eaten of the tree prior to being kicked out of the Garden of Eden? And so I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that a lot of people have interpreted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a sort of one-time thing, that if you ever once eat from, tree of life, if you ever once eat from the tree of life, then you're going to be immortal and live forever. And so if that theory is true, then clearly Adam would not have eaten of the tree of life prior to getting kicked out of the garden, because he didn't live forever, not the way the text presents it. On the other hand, I've never been persuaded by that theory. The way it looks to me is that as long as you continued to eat from the tree of life, you would continue to live. And if that view is correct, then Adam and Eve could have been chowing down on the tree of life all along until they fell. And then God decided, okay, I said they were going to die if they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They've done that, so they can't eat from the tree of life anymore. So lest the man put out his hand and continue to eat from the tree of life, he gets kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So in terms of how the text presents it, and partially this is connected with the way verb tenses work in Hebrew that is different than the way verb tenses work in English. I think that, to my mind, the more plausible interpretation would be that you need to continue to eat from the tree of life in order to continue to remain alive. And therefore, Adam and Eve may have been eating from the tree of life prior to the fall.
Rick, thanks. I'm going to keep going, try to get as many on as I can. Liam's in New York listening on WOPG. Liam, thank you for the call. Go ahead with your question.
Nice. Thank you, guys. So I have a Protestant friend who constantly brings up premillennialism in the early church fathers.
Okay.
And he kind of he uses it as an argument against the Catholic faith because he says, like, most of the early church fathers, simultaneously agreed on premillennialism, and then after like Augustine, it all kind of changed. So I'm just wondering if there were any early church fathers that you knew of that like definitely were not premillennialists.
Yeah. And so the first thing I'd have to say is the Catholic Church, I mean, it doesn't accept certain understandings of premillennialism. But if you want to say that there's a future millennium, that's going to be really awesome, that's still in our future, there are certain versions of it that are compatible with the Catholic understanding of the Christian faith. And I mean, this isn't really the place to go into that in more detail. There are a whole bunch of qualifiers that I need to explain that we don't have time for. Like Jesus doesn't actually return 1,000 years before the end of the world. So this isn't really a disproof of Catholicism. It's also not a definitive teaching of the Catholic Church. It's actually rather a light teaching of the Catholic Church that rejects premillennialism. The document that deals with it comes from the Holy Office from the first part of the 20th century, and it had a very mild rejection. It said this doctrine cannot safely be taught, which technically doesn't even mean it's false. It just means it's not safe to teach it. Having said that, there definitely are church fathers who both before and after the time of Augustine, who were not premillennial. They didn't have that term back then, so they referred to them as millennialists or chiliasts from the Greek word for 1,000, and then millennium is from the Latin word for 1,000. An example of an early Christian writer that would not be a premillennialist, who lived before Augustine, would be Eusebius of Caesarea, the father of church history. He was one of a number of church fathers who were not millennialists. He looked down on millennialists, and he was one of quite a number. You can find such fathers fairly easily from the 300s forward. Now, what about the first 2 centuries? Well, it so happens that we don't have any references to this question one way or another until we get to the mid-2nd century. So we don't have any independent commentary on this. We have some interesting statements pertaining to the future age, but we don't really have a direct engagement of premillennialism until the writings of Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century. And when Justin Martyr introduces the subject and begins talking about it, it's in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. He's talking about his opinion. And Justin is a premillennialist, but he feels compelled to note to Trypho that there are many Christians of true belief and true faith who don't agree with his position. So right there in the earliest record we have that specifically engages the question of premillennialism, we've got an admission that there's a difference of opinion among perfectly Orthodox Christians on this subject. So it is not the case that everybody recognized you got to be a premillennialist. As far back as the historical record allows us to peer, we had a division on this point, with even the first guy to talk about it in a surviving record acknowledging many Christians who are perfectly Orthodox and true of faith don't buy this interpretation.
Liam, again, I will say thank you. I hope that was helpful to you. On we go to Laura in Florida, watching on YouTube. Laura, thank you for your call. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Thank you so much, guys. I have to say my husband came into the church 2 years ago, and he used to binge on Ancient Aliens, and now he binges Jimmy Aiken. I really appreciate all your help.
Thank you.
What a nice thing, Laura. Thank you for that.
My question is, we're doing a Bible study with some people from Church of Christ, and when it came to baptism, their problem with infant baptism was original sin, and I think that they don't believe original sin transferred to future generations. and that was their sticking point. So where do we get the theology that infant baptism is to remove original sin?
So they probably have a different understanding of original sin than Catholics do. The term original sin is used differently in the Protestant community than it is in the Catholic community. In some Protestant communities, original sin gets understood as something that we are personally at fault for. So the idea is Adam and Eve sinned, and they were guilty of sin against God, and we are similarly, because we're their descendants, we are similarly born guilty. And that's a position you find in some Protestant circles. Like, for example, you may find that in some Calvinist circles. But that is not the view that you typically have in Church of Christ circles. You mentioned this is a Church of Christ study. And Church of Christ circles want to look at that and say that's ridiculous. Babies have not done anything against God, therefore it would not be fair for God to hold them as being guilty when they didn't do anything. Okay, you know what? Catholic Church totally agrees. That is not how we use the term original sin. We don't use it to refer to something where God holds us personally guilty for what Adam and Eve did. We agree that would be unfair. And therefore, since God is fair, God does not do that. He does not hold babies as being guilty of something that they never did, or anybody of something that they never did. So how do Catholics understand original sin? Well, we understand it to be a state in which we're born without the grace of God in our souls in a way that would allow us to be in spiritual union with God. That's why we need to turn to God and we need to accept His grace. And then He puts His grace in our souls and we enter into a spiritual union with Him. But because Adam and Eve threw away the family jewels, so to speak, they originally had this grace, and then they lost it through their fall. They couldn't pass that grace on to us, and so we need to acquire that grace in our own lives. That's why we need to turn to God. That's why we need to accept His grace, and that's what baptism does for us. St. Paul, among other New Testament authors, talks about it giving us new spiritual life. St. Peter, frankly, says baptism now saves you. And St. Paul in Colossians 2 refers to baptism as the circumcision of Christ. It's the Christian equivalent of circumcision. Well, circumcision brought Jewish baby boys into God's covenant, and early Christians said, you know what? We want our children in God's covenant as soon as possible. And so they would baptize them, and it's understood that this gives them the grace. It gives them the spiritual life that St. Paul talked about that we're born without. And so even though babies are innocent, they're not guilty of anything, they also don't have the grace that we need to be in union with God. That's why we need to turn to God in our lives. And Christians of a traditional stripe, including Catholics, want to see their children have God's grace in their lives as soon as possible, and that's why they baptize them.
Okay, so it's not removing the stain of original sin then?
Well, it is the way Catholics use the term original sin, because what original sin in the Catholic sense is just being deprived of sanctifying grace. And so when you give someone sanctifying grace in baptism, yeah, their original sin's gone. They're not deprived of sanctifying grace anymore. But it doesn't refer to the idea that God is holding this baby guilty for something it never did. That's something you find in some Protestant circles, and Church of Christ members rightly reject that idea. But that's not what we mean when we use the term original sin.
Okay, perfect.
Laura, thank you very much. Thank you for the call. Let's see if we can get Nancy in Utah to give us her question. Nancy, are you there with us? Oh, hang on, Nancy. Nancy, I'm having a little trouble with the phones. Can somebody help me by pushing line 3? It won't go for me. Nancy, Utah? I'll tell you what, we'll get to Nancy when we come back. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with the phones. Little blip there. Don't forget, you can get the 20 Answers St. Peter's Challenge collection, 30 20 Answers books, 600 questions answered, available right now at shop.catholic.com. We got a line open, maybe 2 lines open. Not exactly sure what's going on that line 3. We'll figure that out, but that does mean at least 1 line open. And if you'd like to talk with Jimmy, give us a call, 888-318-7884. When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
Is relativism dead? It sure seems dead. Each day, new moral demands are made, and they are presented to us as absolutes. Everything, from transgender ideology to physician-assisted suicide, is presented as a moral good that all right-thinking people must accept. But Catholic Answers' own Carlo Broussard says look deeper, and you will see today's moralism is just relativism dressed up in new clothes. Carlo's eye-opening book, The New Relativism, shines a light on how the sacred moral teachings of this age cover up a deep denial of moral truth. Order your copy of The New Relativism today at shop.catholic.com and be prepared to defend the truth against aggressive relativism. The New Relativism at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. It's an open forum. Lines just staying full all day today. Let's try Nancy in Utah again. Nancy, we got you there with us?
Did you say the lions are just staying full all day? Like they're
they're eating everything.
Diet of meat or something?
They've been killing gazelles. It's been wild. Yes.
Okay, cool.
I may have said lions, but if I did, what I meant was lines. And
okay.
I'm concerned about Nancy, though. Nancy, can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, beautiful.
And it was my fault. It was my fault. You couldn't before. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay, but thank you for saying that, because in the meeting later, when we try to assign blame, now it can't be assigned to me, Nancy. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I owe it to you because you took me wrong on a comment I made once about clean-shaven men.
Oh, I did?
Okay, but my question.
I'm sorry I did that, Nancy. Go ahead with the question.
I felt guilty ever since.
I'm so sorry.
I'm making a statue. I'm going to call it Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
All the art I see from ancient times back, all the women have a head covering. Mm-hmm. Would it be okay if I slip this thing around her shoulders and over her arm? Does she have to have her head covered?
Well, no, it's your choice. As the artist, you can make whatever artistic decisions you choose. If you're asking in terms of what historically would have happened, I can give you some insight on that. But you don't have to stick with history in your art. Even artistic representations frequently take what's known as artistic license, and so you don't have to stick to exactly the way things would have been. But having raised the question, how would things have been? Well, there are various cultures where women wear head coverings, and they don't wear them 24 hours a day. Nobody does that. Typically, in the cultures where women wear head coverings, they will wear them in certain situations. Like if they are going outside of their home, they may wear head coverings, but they don't wear them inside the house in private. That's true even in cultures like Afghanistan, where, you know, women wear burqas that cover their entire bodies. They don't wear those when they're at home. They wear those when they go out. In terms of first century Jewish practice, I know that Jewish women would, especially in a Christian context, they would wear head coverings in religious ceremonies. And St. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 6. So I think there are good odds that Mary Magdalene almost certainly would have worn a head covering as part of a religious service, and she probably would have worn a head covering when she was out in public. That's my understanding, although I haven't verified that. But if you want to have her wearing a head covering, you certainly can. That would be in line with depicting her in a religious service or depicting her out in public, but you don't have to have her wearing a head covering if you don't want.
Okay, I'm going to have it just a little slipped off.
Okay, that's fine. You're the artist. You get to choose.
If when you get it done, you want to send us a picture, I'd kind of like to see it now. Nancy.
Yeah.
Especially because now I feel bad that I made some smart aleck comment that made you feel bad, Nancy. I do that sometimes. I apologize.
No, I'm the guilty one. Would you stop that?
Oh, okay. All right. I got to remember.
I'm going to have to separate you two like those chipmunks that keep apologizing.
It's your fault. Oh, no, Dale. My fault. No, Chip. My fault. All right, Nancy, if you want to send it to us, email it to us. If you got a picture of it, send it to radio@catholic.com. And I'll look forward to talking with you again. Next time it'll be my fault. Joseph in Michigan is next. Joseph, thank you for waiting. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Yes, I have heard indirectly that the Jehovah's Witness organization, which incidentally I'm not a member of, claims that Jesus was crucified on a stake rather than a cross. Mm-hmm. My question is, historically, is there evidence that the early Christians used the cross?
Oh, yeah. This is one of a number of things where Jehovah's Witnesses have some rather eccentric ideas. They point out correctly that the term that is used for cross in the Greek New Testament, stauros, can refer to what they will sometimes call a torture stake. It doesn't have to have a cross beam. But what they neglect is that that the term stauros also can be used for an actual cross with a crossbeam, or a crux in Latin. And so the term itself doesn't settle the issue, and we need to look to additional data to try to settle it. Well, what additional data do we have? We do have representations of crucifixion, because it's the Romans who use it, and we have references to Romans using crucifixion on a variety of victims and that are being executed. And Cy, you know what they called crucifixion in Latin?
Crucifixion?
Crucifixion, yeah. So
all right.
they're nailing. Facere means to make, and crux means cross. So if you crucificere people, you're nailing them to a cross. And so we know from Roman sources, they were crosses. They had cross beams. They weren't just stakes, at least not typically. So just even the Roman term for this form of execution tells you that they were crosses with crossbeams. We also have evidence from early Christian sources that point to the same thing. We have writings of early Christians that talk about Jesus's cross, including Latin writings that use the term crux, and we have graffito Now, this is particularly interesting. There's a very famous graffito from like the 2nd century, and it depicts, I'm going to blank on his name. It's not Anaxagoras, but it's something like that. And it depicts a Christian boy that is worshiping a donkey-headed man, and Anaxagoras is not, or Anaxagoras is not the guy's name, but I'm going to use it just for convenience. The graffito says Anaxagoras adores his god. Okay, so that's what it depicts. It's got this person, a male, who's adoring a donkey-headed man, and the donkey head is to mock the person doing the adoring. It's like, this is such a stupid guy. He's worshiping a stupid god because it's got a donkey head. So this is mockery. But the donkey-headed man is crucified with his arms outstretched on a cross. And this is recognized as a piece of graffito that was made by pagans to mock Christians. This is like the nasty little schoolboy who's a pagan making fun of another schoolboy who's a Christian. It's that same level of sophomoric humor. And that shows that even pagans recognized that Christians worshiped Christ crucified.
What do you think of that?
I think you've answered my question very well. Thank you. God bless you all for your work.
You too. Thank you very much. I feel very proud of my Latin on that one. I got to say.
You did. Yeah. I mean, you said it in English, but that was all I was looking for.
Well, how do you say it? Like, would I say it with like an Italian accent?
No, it'd be like crucificare.
Oh, I gotcha. Nick's in Loveland, Ohio, listening on 740 AM. Nick, glad you're here. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hi, Jimmy. How's it going?
Going okay.
Okay, so I had a question about a verse that I was going back and forth with a friend about the Eucharist, and she was saying that in Acts 15:28, it says the letter to the Gentiles, and Paul is saying that you should abstain from blood and the things that are strangled, but mainly blood. And so, if even in the New Testament you are being forbidden from drinking blood, then probably Jesus isn't saying actually drink my blood. And so I tried to find, so I did some research into it and trying to find a good explanation. And one explanation was, this is Paul saying it's he's continuing the old law. But when exactly did we switch after? Because I didn't find anywhere else in Acts where they said, by the way, this letter's not binding. So if it really is just this continuation of the old law, but it got maybe changed afterward, or something, like when did that change occur?
So I need to sort out a few things here. The first one is, this is not in Acts 15:28. Paul is not talking. Paul does not is not speaking at that point. That verse is part of the letter that gets sent along with Paul and Barnabas and a couple of messengers to the church at Antioch. And later, Paul and Barnabas also take it to some other churches. But the letter is essentially a conciliar decision. It's what the council decided. It's not what Paul himself is saying. He's willing to go along with the council for practical reasons, but that doesn't mean Paul thinks that eating blood is forbidden. What the council did was it made a basic ruling that Gentiles do not need to keep the law of Moses, and that would include the ritual requirements of the law of Moses, like don't consume blood. But then James at the council proposes, hey, we've got Moses being preached in every city that has a Jewish population, and that's going to cause potential friction between Jews and Gentile Christians. So let's add these certain provisions to help Jews and Christians live together harmoniously. That doesn't mean, and so they pass these 4 provisions, one of which is abstain from blood, because that's offensive to Jewish sensibilities. Doesn't mean it's intrinsically wrong, just means it's offensive enough to Jewish sensibilities that they don't want Gentile Christians doing it so that it doesn't cause problems between Jews and Gentiles. And Paul is willing to go along with that. But that doesn't mean that Paul endorsed that view. In fact, if you read his letters, like 1 Corinthians, that were written after this council, this Acts 15 council occurred about the year AD 49, and 1 Corinthians is written about AD 53, you see Paul not really endorsing or not maintaining those 4 provisions that the council asked for. And so, like, for example, idol meat is the classic one. One of the things they say is in Acts 15 is we don't want Gentile Christians eating meat that has been offered to idols. But you read 1 Corinthians and also you read Romans 14, and it's clear Paul does not have a problem with eating meat that's been offered to idols, as long as you're doing it in a way that doesn't lead people into sin. So it seems to me that Paul was willing to accept the council's rulings for purposes of Jewish Christian harmony in the church, but he didn't actually believe that God's law required us to abstain from blood. In fact, you kind of can't abstain from blood if you eat meat, not in a fully literal sense. What you can do, and what Jewish people did, is they would open the veins of the animal that they had butchered, and then they would let the blood drain out. But you never get all the blood out. There's always going to be more blood in the carcass, including in its tissues, because that's how nutrients get to the individual cells in its tissues. Blood carries it. So there's going to be blood cells in that carcass no matter how long you let it drain. So this was never a literal requirement. It was always something that was a ritual requirement, because since blood is necessary for life and life belongs to God, Jewish people said, okay, and God was willing to accept this, said, let's not eat the blood because that, properly speaking, belongs to God. But you never really get it all out. So we shouldn't be scrupulous about this. We should recognize it as a ritual requirement of the Jewish people prior to the time of Christ, and that was asked of Gentiles for a time to avoid Jewish Christian friction in the first century. But even in the first century, Paul did not seem to recognize those Acts 15 provisions as literally binding on Gentiles in conscience, that they were literally requirements of God's law. Certainly not all of them, because he doesn't care if you eat idol meat as long as you're not leading someone into sin.
Nick, that brings us to the break, so we'll be right back. Thank you very much for the call. More open forum right after this with Jimmy Akin.
Hang on. Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
One of the biggest mistakes a Christian can make is to try to do good without God's help. St. Therese said, when we trust only ourselves and not God, our soul becomes incapable of virtue. Her remedy? Works of charity. And the greatest work of charity is to share the gospel. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we encourage you to share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Jesus. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. StreetEvangelization.com.
This is Jack Williams, General Manager of EWTN Radio. As we look forward to the new year, we want to thank you for listening and encourage you to stay tuned in the coming weeks for some exciting programming announcements that are sure to make 2024 the best year ever for EWTN Radio. As we strive to continue the legacy of evangelization born out of Mother Angelica's vision, please keep us in your prayers and know that we pray for you daily. God bless you all.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live, open forum. Just been moving through the calls today because so many for Jimmy Akin. Jimmy Akin, our guest. Jimmy, of course, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, the author of a lot of things, including A Daily Defense, 365 Days plus one to Becoming a Better Apologist, and The Bible is a Catholic Book, and The Words of Eternal Life, True Happiness and Where to Find It, and the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And on the line, still callers waiting. So back we go to the phones. Bobby's in Rome, Georgia, watching on YouTube. Bobby, welcome. Go ahead with your question.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Hi, Bobby.
I just want you all to know that last week, my wife and I were blessed enough to meet Pope Francis, and we carried everyone at Catholic Answers in our hearts and your attention.
Thank you.
And Pope Francis blessed us and prayed for you. He even prayed for you, Cy. So,
wait, now you make it sound like that's beneath his dignity or something, Bobby. That was good up to that point, but Bobby, that's a beautiful thing. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make my question quick because I know Jimmy likes quick questions. Why is Tertullian not a saint?
Tertullian is not a saint because of the way his career unfolded. Basically, now you'll hear some people say that Tertullian became a member of a sect known as the Montanists, which believed in the false prophecies of a guy named Montanus, as well as his sort of two female assistants who were also prophetesses. And Montanus claimed, among other things, he was from a place called Pontus in modern Turkey, and among other things claimed that the heavenly city New Jerusalem was going to descend on his hometown in Pontus, and he also said some things about him and the Holy Spirit that were problematic. And the Montanists also had a really strict moral code. Among other things, they thought that you could not be forgiven if you'd committed adultery, that was an unforgivable sin. And that actually was appealing to Tertullian. And you'll hear some people say he became a Montanist. If based on the reading that I've done, it's not clear to me that he actually became a Montanist, but he was certainly sympathetic to Montanists, even if he didn't formally become one. And since they were a heretical sect, he gets disqualified on the grounds of you need to be Orthodox and you need to finish Orthodox in order to be classified as a church father. So that's the basic reason he's not a church father, is because he deviated from Orthodoxy in his later career.
Okay, but some of his writings are quoted in the Catechism. That's okay?
Yeah. He's still a valuable witness to early Christian belief. What you won't find quoted in the Catechism is stuff where he says problematic Montanist junk.
Okay.
But he's still a valuable witness to the early Christian faith, especially in his earlier Orthodox period.
So what caused him to change?
He became convinced of various positions that were more similar to those of the Montanists. I always hesitate to try to read anybody's heart and psychologize, their shift in beliefs. But I think that if I allow myself to indulge in a little bit of that, I think that he became increasingly rigorous in his moral views and was scandalized by the more forgiving attitude that people in mainstream Catholicism, including the Pope, showed to those who had committed sins, including especially the sin of adultery. For example, there's a first century Christian writing known as the Shepherd of Hermas. And in Hermas, it talks about how Christians can be forgiven even for things like adultery. And so Tertullian would refer to it as the awful shepherd of the adulterers. And similarly, he didn't like, the Pope being willing to extend forgiveness, pardon to people who had committed sins like adultery. And it was his views on these moral issues that at least based on what reading I've done in this area, that may have kind of pushed him in this direction.
Bobby, I'm going to leave it there. Try to get our last callers on.
Also, frankly, he was a jerk. But that's a separate question. Then can he be a valuable witness to early Christian belief?
But Pope Francis would have prayed even for him, Bobby.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to move on. Thank you for that. And thank you for the prayers as well, Bobby. Very, very much. Tom's in Arkansas watching on YouTube. Tom, go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
All right. Hey, guys. How are y'all?
Very well. Thank you.
Good. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background before I ask my question.
Just we're getting close to the end, so not too much background, Tom. If you can get as...
Okay. Perfect. So I have a 13-year-old daughter. She's going through her confirmation classes. Her mother and I are no longer married. When her mother remarried, she married a Catholic. And so naturally my kids became Catholic. Then I became Catholic, and it's been great. But she came to me the other day not wanting to go through confirmation and feeling like she was forced to become Catholic. What's the best way to answer her and help her understand, confirmation and all of that?
Okay, so let me make sure I understand her situation. Your former wife married a Catholic, and at that point, your former wife and your daughter became Catholic. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you were not directly involved in your daughter becoming Catholic?
No. She asked if I was okay with it, and I was perfectly fine with it.
Yeah, but you weren't one of the people leading her. So what we've got here is a situation where if she's saying she was forced to become Catholic, she's at this point interpreting her mom and stepdad as having coerced her to use into becoming Catholic. That is unfortunate. It is not entirely unexpected. There can be very sensitive situations when you're dealing with what's sometimes called a broken home, and where a divorce has regrettably taken place. Kids can have feelings that, being 13, being a teenager is automatically for very many teens an unsettling experience where their bodies are changing, their hormones are changing, their emotions are changing, and they can develop resentments towards parents, especially in a situation where the parents are no longer together. And so this could be, on some level, even though I just said I hate to psychologize people, on some level it could be this is your daughter mad at her mother and trying to curry favor with you or lash out at her mother on some level. It may not. This may be, in other words, an emotional issue rather than a strictly intellectual issue. And kids often say things when they're in these emotional periods that are kind of rationalizations. And so she may not have actually been forced to become Catholic. That may be how she's viewing it now, but she may not actually have been forced. Having said, and the reason I say all that is just to kind of give some background, make sure that you're aware of things that I'm sure you're actually already aware of, but just to kind of get them on the table. Here are some factors that you may encounter in this discussion with your daughter. This may not really be an intellectual issue. This may really be an emotional issue, and you may not be able to address it in an intellectual way. Having said that, how would I address it? Well, I'd say, confirmation is something that we see in the New Testament. It's, for example, found in Acts chapter 8, where Philip the evangelist has baptized the Samaritans, but he's only an evangelist. He's not a bishop. He's not an apostle. And so they have to bring in the apostles Peter and John to complete the process of Christian initiation by laying hands on the Samaritans. So we see this as something that's important, and I hear the music, so I'm going to have to go. But basically, I'd tell her, hey, I'm Catholic too. If you have questions about whether you should be Catholic, they've got a lot of resources at Catholic Answers. They'd be happy to answer your questions and any concerns you have. And this is something that, we can work through over time. So I would be optimistic and loving.
And we will have to leave it there because, as Jimmy said, the music is playing. That means we are done for the day. Jimmy, thank you for 2 hours. Enjoyed that.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Boy, you worked hard. You got through a lot of questions today.
Cool.
That'll do it for us. We'll see you tomorrow, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live.